is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great work remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, and that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. You know, I find it most peculiar that that short address which I gave at Gettysburg, which took only less than 2 minutes to recite, and which I fully expected would be forgotten by the twilight of that day, is now my chief means of identification, particularly among so many of our young people. But despite the honors accorded to me, like my statue sitting in my rotunda down in Washington, and my appearance on more than one unit of your currency, the only other historical figure you so honor are Thomas Jefferson and the father of our country, George Washington, there are a few things that I have said, accomplished, and felt that are still generally unknown or passed over lightly by the historians. And to be honest with you, I kind of welcome an opportunity to share some of them here with you this evening. Now, excuse me, but I do want to get a bit more comfortable. I never could abide this bow tie or a tight collar. Now, if any of you folks would like to shed some of your outer clothing, loosen your ties at least, gents, and kick off your shoes, ladies, you go right ahead. There's no sense in being uncomfortable while we sit around and visit for a spell. Oh, wait, I really have to get these boots off. You know, I am a firm believer that feet have a right to breathe. No matter what Mary might say. Oh, that's better. You know, I'm convinced that the good Lord put me together with leftover parts. You know, a tall, skinny body, arms and legs much too long, and worst of all, 2 different-sized feet. Well, the pity of it is that there is some poor soul walking around out there with the other 2 mismatched feet, and I'm sure he's just as uncomfortable in his boots as I am in mine. How many of you folks have ever visited Niagara Falls, huh? Can I have a show of hands? Oh my, quite a few I see. And what impressed you most, ma'am, about the falls? Anyone? The size of the falls? Yes? Well, did anyone ever think of where in the world did all that water come from? Well, what mysterious power is it that millions and millions of people are drawn to the falls every year? I mean, every effect is just as any intelligent man or woman would anticipate without having to see them. You know, if water is coming down this great river, and suddenly there is a perpendicular jog of 100 feet in the bottom of its riverbed, well, it's plain that water will have a continuous and violent plunge at that point. And water thus plunging will foam and roar and send up a mist continuously, into which will appear during sunshine perpetual rainbows. Now, the geologist would tell us that the lip or plunge of the falls was once way back here at Lake Ontario and has worn its way steadily through the years down to its present position. He will ascertain how fast it is wearing and finally tell us that this world is at least 14,000 years old. But the mere physical presence of Niagara is not really its greatest charm. For me, it has the power to excite the emotions and stimulate the imagination. Think with me for a moment. When Columbus first set sail for this continent, when Jesus Christ suffered on the cross, when Moses led his people through the Red Sea, nay, even when Adam first came from the hand of his Maker, then as now Niagara was roaring. And in that long, long time, it has never stood still for a moment, never froze, never slept, never rested. And isn't that fitting testimony to the wonder of God's creation? You know, I probably had my picture taken more than any other person of my time. I suppose that's not too surprising, what with picture taking so being such a new fang-dangled process then, and me being president. Of course, I had my new whiskers to show off. Always wondered what my friends must have thought who only knew me clean-shaven before the election. Always had that sneaky feeling that some of them might have thought that the real me went into hiding once the election took place. Well, nevertheless, one person who certainly got to know me pretty well was old Matthew Brady. Yes, sir. Every time I seemed to turn around, there he was, just a hankering to set me down in his studio. And at first it was quite an honor. I mean, Mr. Brady had the reputation of being the best photographer of our time, and rightly so. But his clients were generally, rich and famous, two categories that certainly did not apply to me. But be that as it may, there is no doubt in my mind that Mr. Brady made me president. Yes, sir. When I gave that speech in New York City at the Cooper Union Institute in February of '60, why, he took me down and set me down in quite a handsome pose. A picture which subsequently was to get a split rail fence to frame it to celebrate my reputation with the axe. They used to call me the rail splitter, you know. And that picture was circulated on every pillar and post throughout the countryside. A first for any presidential candidate, I'm sure. And between that and having old Horace Greeley give my speech a favorable review, you remember him. He was that famous editor that said, "Go west, young man." Well, that sure gave me a shove and a feeling of confidence that, yes, indeed, I could reach the White House, which, of course, I did some 9 months later. Let me see. There were a couple of other pictures that some fellow back home in Springfield took that got some circulation, too, that summer. They were all pretty good, but, you know, they were all so formal and stiff-like. There I'd be in my coat and collar and a string tie done up in a bow like I was going to some kind of formal dinner party. Never occurred to anyone to take a picture any other way. Never had one taken with Mary, leastwise that I'm aware of anyways. So, before we finish our little get-together here this evening, I'm going to bust out of all that formality and let you all, who may have brought your cameras, take all the pictures of me you'd like, smiling, smiling to beat the band. Why, you might even get me to pose with my hands in my pockets. Wouldn't that be a shocker? Old Abe having his picture took with his hands in his pockets? I wonder what Mary would say to that, if she ever found out. You know, there was a short letter I received from a small lady that also played a rather large part in my becoming president. Let me share it with you. It's addressed to Dear Honorable Mr. Abraham Lincoln. Now, my father has just come home from the fair and brought home your picture. I am a little girl, only 11 years old, but want you should be President of the United States very much. So I hope you won't think me very bold to write to such a great man as you are. Have you any little girls about as large as I am? If so, give them my love and tell her to write to me, if you cannot answer this letter. I have got 4 brothers, and part of them will vote for you anyways. And if you let your whiskers grow, I will try and get the rest of them to vote for you too. Now, do you follow that? I don't have any little girls, so I guess I'm the lucky one who had to answer her letter, which I was very happy to do, of course. But here's the interesting part. Part of her 4 brothers are going to vote for me anyways. She don't say which part. But if I let my whiskers grow, she'll try to get all the parts together in time to vote for me. I kind of like that. Yes, indeed. Well, anyways, you would look a great deal better, with the whiskers, she means, for your face is so thin. All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president. Now, mind you, she's only 11 years old, and she knows all these feminine wiles already. My father is going to vote for you, and if I was a man, I would vote for you too. But I will try and get everyone to vote for you that I can. I think that rail fence around your picture makes it look very pretty. I've got a little baby sister. She's 9 weeks old and just as cunning as she can be. Write your letter to Grace Bedell, Westfield, Chitangu County, New York. I must not write any more now. Answer this letter right off. Goodbye. Now I ask you, how could anyone resist such a charming request? I mean, it was simple and straightforward, yet she showed me more downright persuasiveness than any 12 politicians I know. I wish she could have voted for me. I wish all the ladies could have voted for me. I'd have liked that. I'd have liked that a great deal. You know, I have never consciously studied the art of paying compliments to women, but if all that has been written and said by orators and poets since the creation of the world in praise of women were applied to the women of America, it would still not do them justice. God bless them. Of course I grew these whiskers, even though no president had ever set himself down in the White House with a full-grown beard before. You know, most folks are as happy or as sad as they make up their minds to be. And, well, growing these whiskers sure changed the way I look to others, and it sure gave me a different look in the mirror. You know, and it gave me a chance to look at myself, and I really needed that. I was coming back from that long trip out to New York, back to Springfield, and I was feeling lonely and a little uncomfortable with myself, and actually bordering on the brink of a black depression. They used to descend upon me fairly regularly. Well, when I finally stopped pacing about the room, I found myself face to face with the mirror over the bureau. And looking into the glass, I remembered how I felt a few weeks before. I was off tromping through the woods by myself when I met a woman riding horseback. Well, I stepped back off the path to let her pass, but instead she drew her mount abruptly to a halt and peering down at me intently said, "I believe you are the ugliest man I ever saw." Well, madam, you're probably right, but I can't help it. "Oh," she said, "you can't help it, that's true, but you might try staying at home where no one can see you." Well, you could see what a black mood that put me in. I was convinced that I must be the ugliest man in the whole world. Well, that so angered me that I took an oath that if I ever saw anyone uglier than me, I'd shoot him on the spot. Well, not long after that, Archie, a lawyer I knew from downstate, came to town. And when I saw him, I said, that's him, that's the man. He's uglier than me. So I ran home at once. I got my long gun down off the wall, and I prowled the streets just to stalk on my man. And in due time, he came along. Halt, Archie, I said, pointing the gun right at his midriffs. Say your prayers, because I'm going to dispatch you to your maker. Why, Mr. Lincoln, he said, what's the matter? What have I done? Well, I took an oath that if I ever met anyone uglier than me, I'd shoot him on the spot. You are uglier, so make ready to die. Well, Mr. Lincoln, he said, looked at me square in the face. He said, do you really think that I am uglier than you? Yes. Well, Mr. Lincoln, he said, very slowly and deliberately, if I am any uglier, fire away. Oh, I'm glad I learned to put my safety on my trigger finger. I could have fired away many times in my lifetime. You know, one of the most brilliant men I ever knew was Judge Stephen Douglas. I remember one of the first times I met him in the Illinois House of Assembly. It was in my first term, and there was a matter being debated on the floor that I wished to express my sentiments about. So I rose and I said, Mr. Speaker, I conceive, but kind of nervousness took over and I had to start again. Mr. Speaker, I conceive. Sir, I conceive that, but I absolutely froze. Now, Senator Douglas, who was much more comfortable since he had been in the House the year before, jumped to his feet and addressed the chair. Mr. Speaker, he said, Mr. Lincoln has conceived 3 times and brought forth no issue. Can we get on with the rest of this matter? That was the first, but certainly not the last time that Mr. Douglas was to get the best of me. Yes, I remember, well, they used to call him the Little Giant. His large, magnificent intellect was housed in such a tiny body. He was, well, I guess only about 5 foot 2 inches tall, I believe. I remember some of my friends calling into question his height and ridiculing him about it, and they came to me with the question about how long the proper length of a man's legs. And I knew that they were after me to make some disparaging remark about the senator. And I simply said to them that I believe that any man's legs ought to be just long enough to reach from his body to the ground. But, you know, I did say a very unkind thing that I never took opportunity to correct. And, you know, I guess it was because it won the crowd over at the time. And we're all guilty of doing that from time to time, are we not? Anyways, Mr. Douglas might have been feeling a mite frustrated, and he launched into a personal attack upon me, calling me, among other things, two-faced. Now, I ask you here in this audience this evening, as I did back then, if I had another face, do you think I'd be wearing this one? Well, anyway, he went on to say that that man, Lincoln, had tried everything and had always been a failure. Mr. Lincoln had been a farmer and failed at that, had been a school teacher and failed, had tried to go into surveying and failed, couldn't succeed as a storekeeper, sold liquor over the counter and failed, had gone into the law and couldn't make a go of that. And now he had gone into politics and was doomed to make that the biggest and worst failure of all. Now, all the while that Mr. Douglas was out here with his arms akimbo and his fist a-pounding, I was in the back of the podium having a grand old time agreeing with every single thing that he had said. But I knew that there were friends of mine in that their audience, and I had to find a way to relieve their feelings. So I ambled over to the podium and acknowledged the the history of my failed achievements that Mr. Douglas had taken the trouble to compile. And yes, indeed, it was true, every word of it. I had worked on a farm, had been a school teacher, tried surveying, did some flatboating, tried mightily to practice the law, and seemingly failed at each and every turn. There was just one thing, however, that the Honorable Mr. Douglas forgot to relate. He says that I sold liquor over the counter. That's true. But while I was on the one side doing the selling, Judge Douglas was always on the other side doing the buying, and I at least had quit my end of it. But you know, that was to bother me in due time, for people might have gotten the wrong impression of Mr. Douglas. I mean, to my knowledge, he never had a problem with drinking to excess, and those of us who have never fallen victim to alcohol have been spared more by the absence of appetite than from any mental or moral superiority over those who have fallen. In my judgment, if you take habitual drunkards as a class of people, their heads and their hearts would bear an advantageous comparison to any other class of people. But nevertheless, I never wanted to create the impression that Mr. Douglas was anything but a right sober man. But he passed on just 3 short years later. We never did reconcile our differences on the slavery question, even though he consented to act as best man by holding my hat for me when I took the oath for office. Yes, our country lost a great patriot, and I a good and worthy friend. But the great moral to be learned here is, what if I had succeeded at one of those honorable occupations? Would the fates have led me to the presidency by some other path? Or were all those failing experiences a case-hardening chain of events, paving the way to my ultimate destiny? You know, Judge Douglas succeeded at so many things that he tried, except that which he coveted the most, the presidency. While I never really had my heart set on being president. That's strange, is it not? You know, of course, that he was an ardent suitor of my Mary. You might say that Douglas and I, among others, were the real objects of her pursuit. You see, Mary Todd was determined to be First Lady of this great country of ours, so your best qualification as a suitor was to be president. It was that simple. So any time I wavered, why, Mary was right there to prod me forward to that ultimate destiny. It took me a little longer to accept Mary's goals as my own, although I believe that my political philosophy began to take shape long before I met Mary Todd. Let's see, yes, it was in my first term in that Illinois Assembly, and I was asked to address a group of my peers and given the freedom, and thereby the responsibility, of choosing my own topic. You know, now those two words, freedom and responsibility, they go hand in hand, don't you know? You cannot have one without the other. Anyway, there had been an outbreak of some mob violence in some of the largest cities back on the East Coast, and it dictated to me, in my inexperience, that there was a breakdown in the rule by law that, if not checked, would soon be irreversible. So I chose to speak on the perpetuation of our political institutions. Now, first and foremost, we must never forget that all those who share in the privileges of government must accept their fair share of the burdens. That's an axiom worth applying at all times. Well, nevertheless, it was my concern then, as it has been since, that time has a way of eroding the human memory. The living history was enshrined in every family that played a part in our successful revolution from the English. But the surviving patriots, who were the original pillars of that temple of liberty, were dying off, crumbling away. And that temple must fall unless we supply other strong supporters hewn from a quarry of sober reason. Passion, once on our side, would soon be a fiery enemy. Reason, cold, calculated, unimpassioned reason must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. Lessons learned from these living histories must be carried forward like a torch and implanted in each succeeding generation, or we, as a nation, will surely fail. And if destruction be our lot, it will come from within. We ourselves will be its author and finisher. We must live as free men through all times, or die by suicide. You know, politicians generally say too much. You know, we can't seem to leave well enough alone. Why, if it were up to us, every rose would be given 2 coats of paint before it were put into the bouquet. And, well, part of this is your fault. Yes, yes it is. People expect, no, people demand comment on every conceivable subject and won't stand still until you have told them what they want to hear. And that gets us fellows into a whole lot of water, telling you what you want to hear, because it's rarely the same as what the folks in the other political camp want to hear. Well, on the question of slavery, I believe that my speech at the Cooper Union that I had referred to earlier summed up all I ever wanted to say on the subject. And since it seemed to be what a large number of my fellow countrymen also wanted to hear at the time, I thought I would read some of it to you so that you might better understand my position thoroughly. Now, let's see, my memory isn't all that good. So, yes, here it is. Straight from the best file a man ever had. Now, if slavery is right, then all words, acts, laws, and constitutions against it are themselves wrong and should be silenced and swept away. If it is right, then we cannot justly object to its nationality, its universality. If it is wrong, they cannot justly insist upon its extension, its enlargement. All they ask, we could readily grant if we thought slavery right. All we ask, they could readily grant if they thought it wrong. However, their thinking it right and our thinking it wrong is the precise fact upon which depends this whole controversy. Thinking it right as they do, they are not to blame for expecting its full recognition as being right, but thinking it wrong as we do, can we yield to them? Can we cast our votes with their view and against our own? Now, in view of the moral, social, and political responsibilities, can we honestly do this? Wrong as we think slavery is, we can yet afford to let it alone where it is, because that much is due to the necessity arising from the actual presence in that part of the nation. But can we, while our votes will prevent it, allow it to spread into the Western territories and to overrun us here in these free states? Now, if our sense of duty forbids this, then let us stand by our duty fearlessly and effectively. Let us be diverted by none of those sophisticated contrivances, such as groping for some middle ground between the right and the wrong. Vain. That's vain as the search for a man who should be neither a living man or a dead man. Such a policy of don't care on a question about which all true men do care is reversing the divine rule and calling not the sinner, but the righteous to repentance. Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations against us, nor frightened from it by menaces of destructions to the government or of dungeons to ourselves. Let us have faith that right makes might. Ah, yes, faith that right makes might. And in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. Now, I don't know what you folks might think of my speech here this evening, but they are my words, and I stand by them. No one but me ever wrote any of my speeches. Now, I used a lot of words like freedom and faith, might, right, and I lived all my days on God's good earth by those words, or tried to. Slavery, a moral fulcrum used by most, albeit unwittingly by some, to split the Union, which I, under oath, was sworn to uphold. Now, long before those proceedings that made me the 16th president of these United States, I was proclaiming and campaigning on the solidarity of the Union of all the states. It was Senator Douglas's blatant attempt to extend slavery into the Western territories that brought me back into the political arena. I had been defeated for office for four or five years on the political sidelines, but I felt the issue to be a critical one. Someone had to challenge him, and I felt it necessary to do that. Slavery had to be contained to those states where it already existed, but go no further. Now, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. That expresses my idea of democracy, and whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. All men created equal, not just a chosen few, or all men except so-and-so and so-and-so. But personal moral convictions notwithstanding, all had to give way to the greater issue at hand, namely saving the Union of these United States. Don't you see, my dear friends, without the Union, our revered Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are relatively worthless. All hail to Jefferson, to that man who had the coolness and the capacity to introduce into an otherwise revolutionary document an abstract truth, pure and clear, so as to embalm it there like a jewel, so that it's applicable today and in all coming days, to stand as a rebuke and a stumbling block to any would-be tyrant or oppressor. I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the Declaration of Independence. Oh, I use the Bible too on occasion. The Gospel according to St. Mark, the 3rd chapter, the 24th verse. If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. Those are Jesus's words. I have often inquired of myself what great principle or idea it was that held this democracy so long together. Oh, it's not just the mere matter of separation of the colonies from the motherland, but rather that sentiment in the Declaration of Independence which gave freedom, not alone to the people of this country, but hope to all the world. It is a fulfillment of that ancient dream which men have held through all times, that they might one day shake off their chains and find freedom in the brotherhood of life. That's the great principle fought for by our founding fathers, and I would rather die than surrender it. Now, this is my interpretation of what the frontier evangelists look like. And if this doesn't put the fear of God into you, nothing will. These itinerant gospel slingers put on quite a show with their dispensing of their good news. Most, not all, but most of them bounced along on their buckboards, living out of their saddlebags, accepting a dinner invitation here and a night's lodging there. I once ran for Congress against one of these evangelists by the name of Peter Cartwright. Now, Brother Cartwright conceded as how I believed in the Almighty, although my refusal to accept a doctrine of hellfire and atonement, for me personally that is, made my religious standing skeptical at best in his eyes and others. One night we were on the speaker's stand together, and the silver-tongued preacher was at his flowery best, waving his arms and exhorting prayers and exhorting his followers to follow his lead into the promised land. Well, suddenly he grew very quiet and said, "All those who desire to lead a new life, turn their hearts over to God, and go to heaven will stand." Well, now, quite a few men, women, and children all stood at those words. He went on a little louder this time. "All those who do not want to go to hell, please stand." Well, now, at these words, everybody in the hall jumped up, except me. With blazing eyes, he pointed a crooked finger at me accusingly and said, "Observe, most of you accepted my invitation to go to heaven, and all save one expressed no desire to go to hell. May I ask you, Mr. Lincoln, where you are going?" Well, now, I knew enough to let those words roll over the horizon, so to speak, before attempting to answer that one. I could feel the expectancy in that crowd of voters, like the calm before the storm strikes. And I rose and I quietly said, I came here knowing that when I do good, I feel good. And when I do bad, I feel bad. That's my religion. And I do believe in treating religious matters with solemnity. Now, the questions that Brother Cartwright propounded are extremely important, but I did not feel called upon to answer them as you all did. Brother Cartwright asked me directly where I am going, and I'll answer him directly. I am going to Congress. And I did. I won that election by the substantial margin of some 1,500 votes. And the first thing I did was to settle my campaign expenses. Now, this is always a ticklish subject. No one gives anyone something for nothing, leastwise a politician. And sooner or later, the recipient is going to be called upon for that pound of flesh. Some request or demand will not only be expected, but demanded by your financial supporters. It's just a matter of time. However, my friends were concerned about my campaign expenses, so they had pulled together and raised a rather lordly sum of some $200. But my only outlay was to buy a jug of cider for some thirsty farmhands that I felt obliged to buy. That set me back 75 cents. So I returned the rest, $199.25. I went off to Washington a poor, but an unfettered man. But let me get back to this outfit. This is a carbon copy of the garb worn by my all-time favorite gospel thumper, a Methodist oracle back home in Indiana. Well, this man used to get so wrought up in his prayers and exhortations that, well, parishioners had to put bricks in his pockets just to keep him down to earth. No? You don't believe me? Well, forgive me, it's just a small fib to illustrate a point. But in this story, every time I tell it, I'm reminded of a little ditty that I learned when I was, oh, so high. And I'd like to sing it for you, if you don't mind my singing. Now, listen, listen, Jesus in his glory, glory, tells us all a story, story, story. Have to listen careful, 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 'cause it is a parable, parable, parable. And it's hard to figure, 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 'cause its meaning bigger, bigger. Oh well, to get on with it. I went to one of his prayer meetings one Sunday evening, sat way in the back of the church with a couple of friends of mine. And I am sure, as he opened the proceedings with his prayers, that he must have caught the Lord's attention, because he scared off all the farm animals for miles around. Well, he announced his text for the evening. I am the Christ, whom I shall represent here this night. Well, now, just about that time, one of God's smaller creatures, a little blue lizard, ran up his leg under the pants of one of his pantaloons. And while he went resolutely on with his sermon, he was all the while scratching and grabbing and scratching at this little critter who was squirming up under his pants. Well, the critters got a little too high, and the preacher got desperate. When he unbuttoned his pants and kicked them off. But he hadn't gotten rid of his antagonist because it had squirmed up under his shirt, and I am the Christ, whom I shall represent this night, came out a little too squeaky and disjointed, and the shirt was dispatched in the general direction of the pants, and the congregation was dazed at the scene unfolding before them. Everything stood very still for a moment. And suddenly, from the front row pew, this little old lady got up and pointing a finger up at that undressed preacher, said in a loud voice, "If you represent Jesus Christ, then I, for one, am done with this church and your Bible." And out she ran. Yes, sir. Some of those prayer meetings were most enlightening. You know, now some people might think harshly of that kind of moral fire and brimstone preaching, but it's important to note that some people need a little demonstration. Well, admittedly, maybe not without pants and shirt, but some prodding to get across the salient point. But nevertheless, it's important to remember that you must walk a mile in the shoes of other people before you cast any judgments. And it's my judgment that it is better for a nation to have a strong morality than a strong military if it is to survive. Now, I have poked fun at a couple of the ministers of God's Word, so let me make amends somewhat by saying that I never knew a group of men more dedicated to their task than these self-effacing, self-sacrificing evangelists. I'm sure that God has a very special place for each and every one of them that carried his word. Now, as to a profession a little closer to my heart, let me say that there is a vague popular belief that lawyers are necessarily dishonest. Now, I say vague because when you consider to what extent lawyers are extended honors and confidences by the people, it seems rather contradictory to call them dishonest. Nevertheless, let no young person choosing the law for a calling yield to any popular belief. Resolve to be honest at all events. Lawyers have a superior opportunity of doing good. I remember a case of Frank Grayson, who was accused of the shooting death of a neighbor. And the case seemed to resolve around the credibility of one man, the eyewitness, Sovine. Now, I was quite young. I was practicing the law for only a short period of time when his mother, the mother of the accused, came to me. She apparently had no other place to turn. It said that her son had been nearly lynched, not once, but twice before he had come to trial. Now, that always raised my hackles. Everyone is entitled to his day in court, no matter what the circumstances or charges may be. Of course, I took the case. And it seemed to me that the case rested solely on the credibility of the one man, Sovine. Well, feelings ran high in the township. That's rather obvious, for two reasons. One, the unprovoked attack took place at the meeting place, which served as a home for the church services, sort of sacred ground, I suppose. And the other was the fact that the victim was the father of two real young children. Now, the courtroom was crowded on the day of the trial, and I kind of laid back silently while the prosecutor presented the people's case. And when he had rested, I began Mr. Grace's defense by cross-examining their eyewitness. You were with the deceased just before the shooting, Mr. Sovine? Then you stood very near to him. You were only 25, 30 feet away from him at the time he was shot? Were you in the field, sir? Oh, you weren't in that clearing. You were in the woods. Oh, what kind of timber was it, Mr. Sovine? beech timber. Beech, that's rather thick in August, is it not? Uh-huh. And you could see the defendant fire the weapon? Yes. And you say it was that long-barreled Colt model that the prosecutor had provided. I see. And just how far away was the defendant at the time of the shooting? A half-mile away? He was a full half-mile away? Yes, I know you answered me twice, Mr. Sovine. I find that remarkable. I'm wondering, where were the lights? How did you see the shooting? Was there a candle on the minister's stand? No, then, well, how did you come to see it? By moonlight. You saw the shooting at 10 o'clock that night by moonlight? Standing in thick beech timber, you saw the weapon, saw the man fire from a half-mile away, saw it all by moonlight 30 feet from the victim. There's no need to shout at me, Mr. Sovine. I'm only repeating what you said. Gentlemen of the jury, and Your Honor, I show you a copy of the Farmer's Almanac for that year, and I enter it as Exhibit A in the defense of Mr. Grayson, particularly that paragraph that deals with the rising of the moon on the night in question. May I quote, "The moon will rise at 12:32 a.m. and be the first day of a new moon." There is no need to tell you, gentlemen, that there was no moon at all on that night, and I request that the marshals arrest this perjured witness on the basis that only a motive to save himself would have allowed him to perjure himself against a person who had done him no harm. Someone in the crowd suddenly shouted out that Sovine had instigated the lynching attempts, and he suddenly broke down and confessed. Mr. Grayson was returned to his mother. So, if you cannot be a good lawyer and an honest lawyer, well then, resolve to be good and honest without being a lawyer. You know, I said earlier that I was to be the first person to bring a full-blown beard to the White House, and that was a personal first. There were other firsts, some happy, some sad, some consequential, some not. One of the most gratifying acts of being president was to proclaim a day where I asked for all to give prayers to their Lord. It was early in the year, I think 1863, when the war was seesawing back and forth and the heavy casualties were rolling in on both sides, and some distinguished gentlemen sitting in the Senate called upon me to set aside a national day of prayer. I readily concurred, and I issued the following proclamation. It is the duty of nations as well as of man to own their dependence upon the overruling power of God, to confess their sins and transgressions in humble sorrow, yet with assured hope that genuine repentance will lead to mercy and pardon, and to recognize the sublime truth announced in the Holy Scriptures and proven by all history that those nations only are blessed whose God is the Lord. Now we have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers wealth and power as no other nation has grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace, multiplied and enriched and strengthened us, and we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us. Therefore I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States of America, call upon everyone of every creed and color to set aside the last Thursday in November as a day of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father. Further, I recommend that prayers be said by all to implore their Almighty to bring peace and union to our war-torn country. Now, less dramatically, I established the first Department of Agriculture so that farmers might have a more direct voice in government. No, I've always been fascinated by the blade of grass. Have you ever given any thought about how it grows? And where there are two blades, where there used to be only one, is both a profit and a pleasure. Ah, farmers, they're the true pioneers of our land, and land was something we had a great deal of when I assumed the presidency. Vast tracts, thousands and thousands of acres, most of it all unassigned and uncharted. So to encourage its settlement, the Homestead Act was passed, which would promise 160 acres to anyone who would settle and establish residency. Well, soon after that landmark piece of legislation was enacted, John Morrill Smith, a great conservative farmer from the state of Vermont, introduced what became known as the Morrill Land Act. Now, this important piece of legislation set aside 13 million acres to the states so that they can establish colleges to teach agriculture and the mechanical arts. This legislation enabled hundreds and thousands of our young people to receive an unheard of education and raise the intellectual level of our entire country. It was the first landmark piece of legislation of its kind in the history of the whole world. Yes, some important legislation was passed while the Civil War raged on. Well, at one point I had to act like a politician. Well, maybe I could sneak this in quietly when you're not paying too much attention. But I have to take responsibility for signing into law the first federal income tax. Yeah, yes, I did. Well, there was a war going on, and we needed the money. Isn't that what I'm supposed to say? Well, we didn't tax the first $800, and that was a whole lot of money. More than the average family made in an entire year. Well, there was also the so-called Emancipation Proclamation, which I issued after being counseled by my generals that it was a prudent military thing to do. It allowed the armies and the generals to enlist many hundreds of thousands of volunteers, very eager to fight at a time when we desperately needed them. What followed was far more important, the 13th Amendment to our revered Constitution, which guaranteed that never again would anyone ever be held in bondage. The door on the slavery question was slammed shut. There was one particular piece of legislation and action that I took that gave me a lot of personal satisfaction. There was a wealthy journalist a retired postmaster general by the name of Amos Kendall, who built a school on his farm for deaf and blind children. Now, during my first term in office, he solicited the Congress to pass legislation to incorporate his school as the Columbia Institute. Now, this legislation opened up the school to all our disadvantaged students from every state in the Union and from every walk of life. A little later, further legislation empowered the school to give college degrees. Now, the young president of that school was a man named Edward Gallaudet, and the school was to be renamed for him sometime later. You know, it was the first and only school to be empowered to issue a degree signed by the President of the United States. Now, that's quite impressive when you consider the quality of the universities already in existence at that time. You know, I kind of wish that I had been the first to sign those diplomas, but it was not to be. Speaking of signing, reminds me that signing treaties with foreign countries is quite an exercise. Sometimes I wonder at their true meaning, whether they're not just the means to some commercial exploitation. Well, nevertheless, to silence some of our critics down Mexico way, remember we had just won a war with them not too long before, and to further consolidate our position in the Caribbean, the very first treaty I signed was with a very small country in Central America. Now, its announced intention was to proclaim everlasting peace and friendship between ourselves and Nicaragua. Now, as I said on another occasion, you can fool all of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time. But you cannot fool all the people all the time. Back on the home front, the National Currency Act was passed, which put an end to chaotic local situations and, in a perverse way, took away the advantage of that local character known as the sharp horse trader, namely me. I remember having many a discussion with a man named Baker, a circuit court judge who used to pass through Springfield regularly, and we would find something to argue over regularly. Well, on this occasion, the subject at hand was the relative value of horses. We made an agreement that we would meet at 9 o'clock sharp in front of the courthouse the following morning and exchange horses. Now, at the appointed time, a few minutes before, I showed up with my wooden sawhorse over my shoulder. No one had said anything about real horses. However, when the judge appeared a few minutes later, I knew immediately that I had been the one that had been had, because he led, or shall I say, pulled, the sorriest piece of horseflesh ever seen in these parts. Well, I walked around this poor animal wondering how in the world it stayed alive, when suddenly he gave out one last wheeze, shuddered, and rolled over and died, poor thing. Well, since it was a few minutes after the appointed time, Judge Baker picked up my wooden sawhorse and off he went, leaving me to pay someone to remove the carcass. I was never so embarrassed in my whole life. My friends and those fellow lawyers never had such an opportunity to poke fun at me, and ever after that, Judge Baker never failed to greet me with, "Hey, giddy up there, big fellow," or "Whoa there, boy," or some such horsey term. whereas the laws of the United States have for some time past and are now opposed, and the execution thereof obstructed in the states of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, by combinations too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of events, or by the powers vested in the marshals by law. Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power vested in me by the Constitution and the laws, have thought fit to call forth, and thereby do call forth, the militia of the several states of the Union, to the aggregate number of 75,000, in order to suppress said combinations and to cause the laws to be duly executed. The details for this object will be immediately communicated to the state authorities through the War Department. Done at the city of Washington this 15th day of April in the year of our Lord 1861, and of the independence of the United States, the 85th year. There it was, the beginning. And if I had had my way, this war would never have begun. But it had indeed. And little did I know then that I would agonize, pray, and anguish over the great Civil War for exactly 4 years. April 15th, 1861, my first proclamation. April 15th, 1865, my last breath. There were many other proclamations that followed. One shortly after the first provided for a complete and absolute blockade of every southern port. Now, no one was more desirous of peace than I was, but there comes a time when it is necessary to put the foot down firmly. Yet still I suffered with the knowledge that many English mill workers suffered by the loss of their jobs as whole plants, yea, even whole English villages shut down for lack of our cotton. Yes, the war was to have a devastating effect on all the people everywhere. That whole 2-week period from the beginning of the firing on Fort Sumter until the arrival of the 7th Regiment from New York was an absolute nightmare. Well, it was like a brush fire with a new blaze breaking out every few minutes, and I in charge of the brigade without a bucket to our name. There was absolutely total confusion, especially in the armed forces. Why, did you know that over 2/3 of all the officers stationed in and around Washington above the rank of captain were Southerners or members of a state sympathetic to the South? What a missed opportunity for them. It was just marvelous for the North that the South was just as disorganized. Absolutely no chain of command, telegraph lines cut, and the railroads subject to all forms of sabotage. The mainline bridge out of Baltimore was destroyed, cutting us off from the whole Northeast corridor. And Maryland was emotionally, if not politically, aligned with the South, so that we in Washington were virtually surrounded. Why, I remember getting a petition from a group of Marylanders protesting the pollution of the ground by the feet of the marching troops, who, by the way, had to march all the way from Pennsylvania to get to us. Waves of rumors flooded Washington. Women and children were being evacuated. How and to where, I never did find out. But I was right proud of Mary. Someone from the press asked her when she and the boys were going to flee for safety. And she staunchly told them, "I am as safe as Mr. Lincoln, and I shall not leave him." For once, Mary made me feel real good. Well, things quieted down once the troops from New York arrived and took their positions around town. Fears of an invasion were quelled, and yet my fears were greatly realized when states continued to secede, and by mid-May, they numbered 10. My dream of holding the Union together politically was dead. Reality had caught up with my fantasy, and the great Civil War was begun. It's difficult to try to sum up my 4 years in the White House. So much took place that all those experiences, that tried to lump them all together, it was like trying to put a lifetime of happenings and cram it all into a 5-pound butter churn. You know what I mean? I mean, the many personal, petty ambitions and jealousies of some of the men around me in juxtaposition with the ultimate sacrifice of so many of our young people was an absolute agony. Duncan is in his grave. Life's fitful fever is o'er. Nothing can touch him now. He sleeps well. Forgive me, but that quotation from Shakespeare rattled around often in my head, primarily when the casualty lists were jangled in front of me, and my heart would sink as fast as a trip hammer. November 21st, 1864, to Mrs. Bixby, Boston, Massachusetts. Dear Madam, I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any word of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage your anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours, very sincerely and respectfully, Abe Lincoln. This tumult probably accounted for the fact that I never could sign an order for calling for the execution of a soldier charged with desertion. I know I thwarted many a general who was only rightly following Army regulations, but somehow I felt that there was a higher power that reserved that ultimate right of judgment, and I was just his obedient servant. His will was difficult to always accept. The loss of our Willie at the tender age of 11 to the ravages of malaria was an agony that Mary and I never could accept. He broke many a tension as he bounded his way to the hearts of all on the White House staff, and he was a particular favorite of Secretary Stanton, who was with me crying quietly at his bedside at the end. I wasn't aware of it then, but Willie was no doubt responsible for cementing a friendship that had been, until then, cordial but cool. His passing was a tie to bind Mary and I like no other circumstance had ever been able to do. My dearest friend, Joshua, peace does not appear to be so distant as it once was. I hope it will come soon and come to stay. It will then have been proved that among free men there can be no successful appeal from the ballot to the bullet, and that they who take such appeal are sure to lose their case. Still, let us not be overconfident of a speedy final triumph. Let us be quite sober. Let us diligently apply the means, never doubting that a just God will give us the rightful result.
War was finally won. Into the streets people spilled, feeling the excitement build, and the crowd around the White House milled, asking, is it true? It's finally done. Inside the White House, Lincoln heard them calling out his name. He sat there wondering what to say to ease their years of pain. Someone yelled, come out the door, and tell us what you've got in store for the rebels who have lost the war. So out upon the porch, Abe Lincoln came. He said, we are gathered not in anger, but in celebration. Let's be grateful we are once again a single nation. Let's stand together, reassured, now that peace has been secured. Our nation's illness can be cured, and I suggest the overture for this occasion. Settle let the band play its tune. Play that tune that holds its head up high and proud. And let our nation once divided, bloody but unbound, take the swords of war and beat them back into a cloud. On the day that Lee surrendered, Mr. Lincoln told the crowd. But the band played the sea. Tired of Union
There was
soldiers
many occasions where I had to rely on that old mini prayer, and this too shall pass away. It first came to me in a story I read of an Eastern monarch who once charged his wise men to invent him a sentence which would be true and appropriate at all times and in all situations. They gave him these words, and this too shall pass away. How much it expresses. How consoling in the depths of affliction. And yet how chastening in an hour of idle boasting, and this too shall pass away. And yet let us hope that it is not quite true. Let us hope that these human sacrifices shall not have been made in vain, and out of our struggle there shall be a peace and a prosperity whose course shall be onward and upward, and whose course shall not fail away. My friends, not one of us can escape history. We will each be remembered in spite of ourselves. No situation will allow us to pass through unscathed through that fiery path. We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. And so, with charity for all and malice toward none, let us strive on to finish that work which he has given us to do.
In that fading April sun, that lead-handed Grant his sword, the war was finally won. Into the streets the people spilled, feeling the excitement build, and the crowd around the White House milled, asking, is it true? It's finally done. Inside the White House, Lincoln heard them calling out his name. He sat there wondering what to say to ease their years of pain. Someone yelled, come out the door and tell us what you've got in store for the rebels who have lost the war. So out upon the porch, Abe Lincoln came. Said, we are gathered not in anger, but in celebration. Let's be grateful we are once again a single nation. Let's stand together, reassured, now that peace has been secured. Our nation's illness can be cured, and I suggest the overture for this occasion.